In 1903, he stood on a Julian gallows and faced execution for the cold-blooded murder of a 14-year-old boy. He wasn't a bank robber. He didn't ride with a gang. And he didn't kill for money, at least not in the way most outlaws did. He was one of the law's most effective and loyal enforcers. He was a Pinkerton. A detective, a lawman, a scout, and, well, a hired gun. Yet, justice turned its back on him and condemned him to be executed for a crime he may not have committed. This wasn't just the fall of a man, it was the unmasking of a system. A system that turned one of its most lethal enforcers into a liability, and then into a scapegoat, questioning what justice really meant in the old American West. His name is Tom Horn. And in this breakdown and analysis, we are going to look at the crime, the setup, the trial and execution of Tom Horn. We'll bring in theories, experts' insight and analysis of the Tom Horn case that has sparked questions, doubts and conspiracy theories over the years. And at the end, maybe we might just be able to finally understand. Was he a ruthless killer? Or was he framed to protect the powerful? But before we dive into that, who was Tom Horn? Thomas Horn Jr., born November 21, 1860 in Missouri, was not your typical outlaw. He was not driven by theft, fame, or desperation. Instead, his life walked a razor-thin line between legal enforcement and premeditated murder. Horn was a cowboy, U.S. Army scout, Pinkerton detective, and hired killer. He was known to work for cattle barons, killing suspected rustlers when the courts failed to prosecute. His alleged victims didn't always receive due process. Some weren't even legally confirmed rustlers. But what truly pushed his story into historical and legal infamy was the 1901 killing of 14-year-old Willie Nickell, a crime for which Horn was arrested, tried, and eventually executed. The case is still debated today. Was he guilty, or was he framed to silence a liability? Raised in a large family in post-Civil War Missouri, Horn was exposed to instability, trauma, and gun violence from a young age. He left home as a teen, becoming fluent in Spanish, survivalist tactics, and combat. He served as a civilian scout and interpreter during the Apache Wars, becoming closely associated with violent frontier tactics. Horn was emotionally detached and methodical. He displayed signs of moral relativism, believing that extrajudicial killings were justified if the system failed. He had an increasing dependency on alcohol, which may have impaired his judgment and memory. Analysts have noted that Horn fits the profile of a militarized enforcer turned vigilante, desensitized to death and convinced that violence was an acceptable form of justice. From lawman to executioner. The escalation timeline are as follows. 1885 to 1890. He served as a civilian scout for U.S. Army. Exposed to frontier violence and lethal decision-making. 1890s. He was hired by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Tasked with tracking and sometimes killing train robbers, cattle rustlers. Allegedly used lethal force without authorization. 1894 to 1899. He was a private enforcer for Wyoming and Colorado cattle barons. Paid to handle rustlers quietly. Deaths followed his movements. 1901. Willie Nickell, 14, shot near his family's homestead. This marked the turning point, shifted public perception from enforcer to killer. Pattern of escalation. Horn moved from official tasks with legal backing to private, unregulated enforcement contracts. The overlap between legal authority and vigilante justice is key to understanding his eventual downfall. Tom Horn didn't operate in a vacuum. He was empowered and protected by a justice system that lacked centralized oversight. Local lawmen were often outgunned and underpaid. A justice system that depended on private agents. Cattle barons outsourced justice to killers like Horn. A justice system that tolerated violence. As long as cattle theft dropped, no one questioned Horn's methods. Looking at the systemic breakdown, Horn was allowed to operate with implied legal impunity, until one killing made him a liability rather than an asset. His modus operandi was one of quiet admiration to some. Tom Horn's method was consistent, calculated, and to an extent, terrifying in 1. Surveillance. He tracked targets for days, confirming routine and weak spots. 2. Isolation. Victims were killed when alone, usually at long range with a rifle. 3. No confrontation. Unlike traditional outlaws, Horn rarely warned or threatened. He shot to kill. 4. Message. His hits sent warnings to others, stop rustling or you're next. This approach made him a highly effective executioner in an era of chaos, but it also blurred all lines of accountability. Now let's look at the Nickell murder, the crime that changed everything. Victim: Willie Nickell, 14 years old. Date: July 18, 1901. Location: near Iron Mountain, Wyoming. Willie was found shot in the head, lying near his family's gate. His father, Kells Nickell, was in an ongoing feud with local cattlemen over land disputes and alleged rustling. Horn had been working for those same cattlemen at the time. Key suspicion factor was that Horn had made verbal threats about the Nickells days before. A confession was later extracted from Horn while he was intoxicated and unaware he was being recorded. But the confession was not corroborated by physical evidence. No murder weapon was linked to Horn. No witness placed him at the scene. Law enforcement response. Lawman had a problem. Horn's employers were influential. Horn was elusive, skilled, and legally ambiguous. So they set a trap. They got him drunk. They used a federal agent posing as a friend to lure out a confession. They recorded the conversation without informing Horn. Legal breakdown. While not illegal by the standards of 1901, this method raises serious questions about entrapment, due process, and mental capacity. By the end of 1901, the public demanded justice for the boy's murder. The cattleman who once protected Horn withdrew support to avoid association. Horn was charged, and for the first time, the killer became the suspect. The trial. By 1902, pressure was mounting on local law enforcement. The murder of 14-year-old Willie Nickell had sparked outrage, not just because of the boy's age, but because it underscored the growing lawlessness of Wyoming's cattle frontier. Sheriff Ed Smalley and county prosecutors knew they needed a conviction. And Tom Horn, already known for a string of extrajudicial killings, was the perfect scapegoat, or the perfect suspect depending on perspective. But there was a problem. There was no physical evidence linking Horn to the crime. Key evidence. A supposed confession made by Horn while he was drunk, to Deputy Marshal Joe LaForce, who posed as a casual acquaintance. Tactic used. LaForce invited Horn to his office under false pretenses and got him talking while secretly recording the conversation. Alleged confession content. Horn reportedly said something along the lines of, "Yes, I fixed him. I put just one shot in the back of his head. It was the best shot I ever made." Issues with the confession. Horn was heavily intoxicated. He was not informed he was being interrogated. No legal counsel was present. The quote was never corroborated with a written or signed statement. No weapon was ever recovered. Legal analysis. Even in early 1900 standards, this method walked a thin ethical line. Today it would be considered coercive and inadmissible. Trial strategy, prosecution versus defense. Prosecution focused on 1. Emphasized the confession. Leaned on Horn's violent reputation. 2. Introduced circumstantial evidence tying Horn to the area. 3. Presented witnesses who heard Horn speak ill of the Nickells before the killing. Defense strategy. 1. Argued the confession was not reliable. 2. Highlighted the lack of forensic or ballistic evidence. 3. Claimed Horn had been framed by lawmen eager for a high-profile arrest. 4. tried to introduce Horn's service to law enforcement as character defense. Critical mistake by defense. The defense underestimated public outrage and failed to secure expert testimony to undermine the confession. They also failed to aggressively challenge the integrity of LaFours, whose credibility was not strongly tested under cross-examination. Key witnesses and testimony analysis. 1. Joe LaFours, deputy marshal, presented the confession. Claimed Horn volunteered the statement. Analysis. LaFours had incentive to secure a conviction and was criticized later for possible coaching of testimony. 2. Victor Miller, teen witness, claimed Horn was seen in the area days before the killing. Weakness. Timeline discrepancies and no direct connection to crime scene. 3. Kells Nickell, father of victim, testified about threats from Horn and conflict with cattle barons. Motivation. Potential bias due to land disputes and desire for retribution. 4. Tom Horn, defendant, was not allowed testify in his own defense. Result. Jury only heard about him through second-hand quotes and his criminal reputation. Legal commentary. The trial leaned heavily on reputation and hearsay over hard facts. The decision to not let Horn testify may have left a vacuum filled by public prejudice. Public perception and media bias. At the time, newspapers were instrumental in shaping public sentiment. The narrative was clear. Tom Horn, the ruthless killer, has finally been brought to justice. Bias factors. 1. Stories sensationalized Horn's past killings. Headlines used emotive language like child killer and executioner. 2. No publication critically examined law enforcement's conduct or motives. Impact. The media contributed to a presumption of guilt, undermining the idea of a fair trial. Jury reaction and verdict. Verdict delivered on October 24, 1902. Outcome: guilty of first-degree murder. Sentence: death by hanging. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the jury believed the confession. Or rather, they believed the version of Horn the prosecution painted. Legal breakdown. The case shows how narrative control, rather than evidence, can determine a trial's outcome. The court failed to ensure Horn's Sixth Amendment rights, particularly the right to confront witnesses and have counsel during critical interrogation. Horn's attorneys appealed on grounds of improper admission of a coerced confession, lack of direct evidence, and prejudice due to character smearing. Appeal outcome: denied. Let's look at what failed in this trial. Key failures identified. 1. Entrapment-style interrogation with no oversight. 2. Trial built on reputation, not evidence. 3. Failure of defense to challenge flawed investigative tactics. 4. Public pressure swaying judicial neutrality. After his conviction in October 1902, Tom Horn was moved to the Cheyenne jail to await execution. Key events. Execution date was set November 20, 1903. Behavior in prison. He reportedly appeared calm, cooperative, but defiant. Visitors, friends, former lawmen, and journalists came to speak with him. Horn asked for a new trial based on procedural concerns but denied without detailed judicial review. Analytical note: Horn's behavior showed signs of resignation, but he remained consistent in denying involvement in Willie Nickell's murder. In the weeks leading to his execution, newspapers and public sentiment splitted. Cattle barons and ranchers were quietly relieved. Horn's execution removed a dangerous loose end. Lawmen divided. Some respected him, others believed he had crossed the line long ago. General public mixed. Many mourned the romanticized, last gunman of the Old West. Others demanded accountability for the child's death. The press. Headlines dramatized the event as "Killer to Hang, End of Tom Horn Saga." Media breakdown. The press did little to question the fairness of the trial. Most framed Horn as a necessary evil finally punished. The execution happened in November 20, 1903. Method: hanging. Device: Julian gallows, a mechanical gallows invented to avoid human error. Location: Laramie County Jail, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Alleged final words attributed to Horn: "You can't stop a man who knows he's right. I never murdered that boy." Execution outcome: he was declared dead at about 11:50 a.m. Autopsy performed. No anomalies. Body was buried in Columbia Cemetery, Boulder, Colorado. Historians noted that Horn's was the last legal hanging in Wyoming. What were the legal and systemic fallout? 1. For law enforcement. Reputation boost, short-term celebration that justice had been served. Long-term stain, historians and legal scholars would later cite the case as a failure of due process. 2. For Wyoming's justice system. Policy reconsideration, scrutiny of confessions, especially those obtained under deception or intoxication. Precedent set, raised national conversations about circumstantial evidence and coerced testimony. 3. For private justice models. Cattle associations distanced themselves from hiring enforcers. Shift towards centralized policing models, including state rangers and county sheriffs assuming more control. Modern legal analysis: did the state fail? Today, most legal scholars agree that Tom Horn's trial would not stand in a modern court. Key issues include: 1. Confession coercion. No Miranda rights, no legal counsel, heavy intoxication. 2. Hearsay heavy prosecution. Weak physical evidence, no direct link to the murder. 3. Public bias and media influence. Trial atmosphere possibly tainted jury neutrality. 4. No appeals court review of key evidence handling. Modern legal insight. The case reveals how circumstantial evidence plus emotional context, in this case a child victim, can override legal safeguards, even when guilt is not definitively proven. Let's now take a look at some speculated theories of innocence. Who really killed Willie Nickell? Several alternate theories emerged in the decades that followed. 1. The father, Kells Nickell, known to be confrontational. Possible theory: conflict with neighbors escalated, and Willie was caught in the crossfire. 2. Rival ranchers may have hired a killer separate from Horn. Wanted to scare Nickell family off disputed land. 3. Another enforcer. Some theorize a second, unknown gunman was active in the area. Horn took the blame to protect others, or was framed by parties cleaning up loose ends. Critical point: no ballistic evidence or eyewitness ever definitively linked Horn to the crime. Only the confession, recorded under unclear conditions, tied him to the murder. Tom Horn remains one of the most debated figures in outlaw history. Was he a folk hero? A man who did dirty work for powerful men and was discarded when inconvenient? Was he an assassin? A killer for hire who believed he was above the law? Or was he a victim of the system? A symbol of systemic failure, used by the state then abandoned without fair trial. Books like The Saga of Tom Horn by Dean Crockle, and films like Tom Horn 1980, starring Steve McQueen, portrays Horn as misunderstood and tragic. Numerous law journals have cited the trial as an example of early 20th century legal malfeasance. Tom Horn's story is not just about a man who straddled the line between law and lawlessness. It's about a justice system that failed to enforce its own standards when it mattered most. His execution closed a chapter on frontier enforcement, but it also opened a new era of judicial scrutiny, procedural reform, and forensic accountability. This case isn't just a Western footnote. It's a template for how justice can be compromised when power, fear, and public emotion override due process. Here are 4 core lessons that can be derived from this case. 1. Due process must be rigidly protected. No matter how dangerous or known a suspect appears, procedural safeguards must be upheld. Horne was denied legal representation during a pivotal confession, a violation by modern standards. 2. Reputation should never substitute for evidence. Horne's violent past shaped the narrative more than hard facts. Courts must judge acts, not reputations. 3. Investigative ethics are non-negotiable. Deceptive tactics by Joe LaForce, drunk interrogation, no Miranda rights, no transparency, would be inadmissible today. 4. Public sentiment can skew justice. The emotional weight of a child's death added pressure to convict someone, and Horne was the most convenient option. Looking at the systemic analysis, the structural failures are as follows. 1. Law enforcement fragmentation. At the time, there was no unified or professional state-level policing in many Western territories. Sheriffs were often elected by popularity, and private detectives like those from the Pinkertons were heavily used by wealthy interests. Breakdown. Over-reliance on private enforcement, Horne included. Inconsistent investigative training. High susceptibility to bribery or intimidation. Horne operated freely for years because there was no structure to stop him. The system that used him for justice later couldn't guarantee him a just trial. 2. The justice system as political tool. Wyoming's officials had more to lose by appearing ineffective than by risking a flawed conviction. The politics of appearing tough on crime outweighed actual integrity. Tom Horne's conviction served to satisfy public outrage and reassert control over lawless territories. In essence, the legal process was used to restore public trust, not to uncover objective truth. Tom Horne's psychology is critical to understand how someone could both enforce the law and break it with near equal conviction. 1. Behavioral profile. Trait evidence. Detached violence. Killed efficiently without hesitation, often at distance. Moral dualism. Justified his killings as necessary justice. Loyalty to authority. Obeyed those who hired him, often without question. Lack of remorse. No apologies offered, only denials or cold admissions. Horne wasn't a thrill seeker or a thief. He wasn't chaotic. He was structured, loyal, and deadly, a man shaped by war, isolation, and the normalization of frontier violence. 2. What makes a legal enforcer cross the line? Psychologically, Horne aligns with what criminal analysts now call a socially sanctioned violent actor. Someone who is permitted, even encouraged, to use violence within a system, until one day that system labels him deviant. In Horne's case, the transition happened when his value to the elite declined. Public tolerance for frontier justice waned. A high-emotion case, a child's murder, demanded a symbol of punishment. Interpretation. Horne didn't just fall from grace, he was sacrificed by the same power structure that once protected him. What modern investigators can also learn from this case are: 1. Always audit power structures. Crimes committed, in the name of order, often go unchecked unless third-party accountability exists. 2. High-profile crimes need higher evidentiary standards. Emotions, especially involving child victims, must not rush justice. 3. Beware of historical oversimplification. Outlaw versus lawman isn't always a clean divide. Many, like Horne, existed in gray zones of legality. 4. Use of informants and private enforcers needs oversight. Private actors like Horne, hired by cattle barons, pose dangerous legal blind spots when they operate with minimal scrutiny. So far, the status of Tom Horne's case still leaves us with unresolved truths. Was Horne guilty of killing Willie Nickell? Unproven. No weapon, no witness, only an unverified confession. Was he responsible for other killings? Likely, multiple deaths followed his assignments. Was he given a fair trial? No. The procedural handling, public bias, and trial inconsistencies fail modern standards of justice. Has the state acknowledged any wrongdoing? No official exoneration, but his case is widely cited in law journals and legal ethics coursework as a wrongful conviction scenario. Tom Horn is often referred to as the last enforcer of the Old West. His story forces us to confront the uncomfortable overlap between law and violence, especially when lawmen act outside the law. He wasn't simply an outlaw. He was a tool of the system, used and discarded when the consequences of his actions became inconvenient. And the justice system, instead of investigating the full context, chose the easier route: conviction over complexity. For all crime analysts and viewers alike, the lesson is clear. Justice without process isn't justice, it's vengeance dressed in law's clothing. Now, what are your thoughts? Do you believe Tom Horn was guilty of murdering Willie Nickell? Should the confession have been admissible? Was Horn a killer, or a scapegoat for a corrupt system? Drop your thoughts in the comments, let's dissect it together.